Hello, assalamu alaikum, and good afternoon, people. So I just had a webinar with UKM just now. So I figured I should do a live because, I'm already in front of the computer, already ready, might as well share something with all of you. So I want to talk about dyslexia today. And honestly, it is a topic that I have stayed away from um, for quite some time because to me personally, I feel like dyslexia has a lot of gray areas. And I feel like if I were to talk about it, there will be so many uncertainties, and I'm afraid I might be saying the wrong thing, right? But then I just finished reading this book. And like I wrote in my post yesterday, I died a few times reading this book. No kidding, because I feel like this is one of the hardest books that I have ever read. I started reading this last year. It was recommended by my professor in Teachers College. Um, I started reading this last year. I read like about 100 pages, and then I stopped, and I pick it up again and stop, I pick it up again, and finally I finished reading it yesterday. So I struggled most at the parts when the writer was talking about neurocognitive research, like the neuro research that they use, the computer models that they use to represent the processes, the brain processes when we are reading. So apparently, of course, the models are not as complicated, not as realistic as our normal brain, but it did give some light into the brain processes that happen when we're reading. But anyway, I want to share some points that I found very profound in this book, and a lot of it has to do with dyslexia. So finally, I'm going to talk about it. So what is dyslexia? So dyslexia apparently has no definitive definition because it will depend on who you ask. The definition will depend on who you ask. But basically, it is related to reading difficulties that is more closely associated with the basic reading skills, meaning decoding. Right? But it doesn't mean that dyslexics do not struggle with comprehension because guess what? The secondary consequence of dyslexia is comprehension difficulty because if you are paying too much attention to decoding print, trying to make out the words, the letters, the sounds, and things like that, you would have less resources in your brain allocated for comprehension. So this has got to do with the phonological working memory or short-term working memory, basically, because our short-term memory can only handle, if I'm not mistaken, was it 5 or 7 plus minus 2? So meaning to say, we have about only 7 items that we can deal with at one time. So if we have allocated 6 of it to decoding, we might have only one for comprehension, right? So this means that um, difficulty in decoding would lead to comprehension difficulty as well. Okay, and then so that's dyslexia. So um, it is also harder to define dyslexia and to identify dyslexia because reading itself is a developmental process, meaning to say, reading is not just that child can read because it depends on at what age. Reading at different ages require different kind of skills, and we expect, of course, different outcomes based on different purposes, right? The purpose of reading at age 7 is not the same as the purpose of reading at age 10, for example. So in the US, they use this terms, learning how to read and reading to learn. So and the first 3 years of schooling, from grade 1 to grade 3, the focus is on reading to learn. Reading to learn? Sorry. Learning to read, sorry. Learning to read. Meaning to say the focus is on to introduce as much text as possible, to equip the child with strategies for word attack, for comprehension, for example, so that the child can learn how to read successfully. But once they get to fourth grade, the focus is on reading to learn. So it is no longer about, how to teach reading. It is more like, okay, there is a content that you need to learn by reading. So that's why I said, how do we identify that a child has a reading difficulty? It depends on what age and what purpose of reading are we looking at. Okay. So dyslexia is a moving target because reading is developmental. And what I found from this book that I feel interesting is that they were saying that dyslexia is a lot like obesity and hypertension. There is no litmus test like yes or no, yes, you are dyslexic, or no, you're not dyslexic. It is because it depends on the cutoff score, right? What instruments, what reading instruments or assessment do you use to assess reading? And then what is the cutoff score that you would say, okay, a score below this mean would mean reading difficulty. So there are some researchers who use a score two standard deviation below the mean as having reading difficulty, and other researchers would use one standard deviation below the mean as having reading difficulty. So well, depending on which cutoff scores you use, you would also have a different percentage of prevalence, right? So if you use like two standard deviation below the mean, you would have maybe 3%. But if you were to use a one standard deviation below the mean, you might have 15%. So yeah, all right. So and also talking about hypertension and obesity, it's the same. Obesity depends on, you wouldn't say that, okay, 70 kilogram means that that person is obese. It depends on the height, the gender. It depends on which country, Asian, European, because we have like different builds apparently, different, I would say, culture, lifestyle that would affect those definitions. So it's the same with reading. Okay, so another thing that is also interesting about dyslexia is that the precursors involve spoken language. So we always thought that dyslexia is specific to reading. Yes, it is specific to reading. However, it also, so I'm not sure whether it's causal or not, the relationship, but it has a precursor in spoken language. So there is this study conducted by Scarborough from this book. So Scarborough conducted a longitudinal study involving two groups of kids. Kids who are at risk because they have parents or siblings that also have reading difficulties, and those who are not at risk. So the kids were followed from age 5 months, is it, or 30 months up to age 5 years old, and then so along those years, of course, they were tested, and it was found that children who developed reading difficulties at age 5 had exhibited spoken language deficits at age 30 months. So, does it mean that if we were to see kids at age 30 months who have spoken language issues, we would consider that kid to be dyslexic? No, not. We don't do that. And this is another reason why dyslexia, defining dyslexia is a bit tricky, because this is like a retrospective kind of a thing, right? The researchers didn't found this at 30 months. They found this at 5 years of age. It's like, is this like, yeah, they regress, they look back. So, and then at age 2.5 years old, these kids, the to be dyslexic kids produce sentences with simpler syntax and pronounce words less accurately. Simpler syntax means um, syntax has got to do with the grammatical structure of words also. So simpler, and also pronounce words less accurately. At age 3 to 4 years old, they exhibited deficits in vocabulary and phonology in terms of rhyming. You know, deciding whether two words begin or end with the same sound or not. That's rhyming. And at 5 years, just prior to school entry, the kids were impaired on pre-reading skills and vocabulary. I find this very profound, because that means that now we know more about dyslexia than we used to know, or we used to think. And another interesting thing is that it says here also that age 3, children who would later develop dyslexia exhibited poor spoken language, vocabulary, expressive language, and grammar. And then the weakness in spoken language persisted. That's very profound. And even at 13, performance on phonological tasks was still impaired. Vocabulary and syntax fell further, in part because they read less. So that has got to do with the Matthew effect. Right. So I feel like those are very important. Those are very important findings, because now we know that I feel personally what I get from this findings, it is less important to identify, to label that a kid is dyslexic, what is more important that is that when we see these deficits, for example, at even younger age, we need to do something about it. We need to intervene. We do not have to, wait until, okay, let's see whether it develops into something. No, we should do something once we already identify those things. And when I say intervention, I don't necessarily mean diagnosing, labeling, you know, I just mean provide extra instruction, for example, or more intense instruction depending on the need. All right, so and then when we talk about dyslexia, we have this misconception. Okay, now it is a misconception, then it wasn't, right? So, with more research, we know now that it is a misconception. But before this, we always thought dyslexics to be kids who reverse letters. Like they write B as D, ke, P as G, ke, reverse letters. And then reverse spelling of words, was, saw, tap, jadi pet, for example. I've seen that in my students. However, this is not a criteria for dyslexics because even good readers, eventually they will become good readers. Even good readers and non-dyslexic poor readers make the same kind of errors. And reversals is a very small error compared to the many other errors that dyslexic kids make. So they have little diagnostic value, meaning to say if we see kids who make this kind of errors, it is not a criteria for dyslexia. Another thing is that we used to think of dyslexia as having the gap between high IQ and poor reading achievement. And surprisingly, it means that if a kid has a normal IQ and the same reading level as that kid with high IQ, this kid wouldn't be considered to be dyslexic because the gap is not wide enough. So this is flawed. This kind of, what do we say, criteria is flawed because what is the cutoff at the IQ level? Which score do we say high? Which score do we say low? And it's the same with reading. Which reading score would we say poor or good is or okay? And how much gap are we talking about? So it is very difficult to determine that. And like I said, because of that, the kid who does not have a wide enough gap wouldn't be called dyslexic and might not receive the extra instruction or help that he or she needs. And then with reading, if you do not receive instruction or intervention, you're not gonna get better even if you are, because time, but even if you are, it wouldn't be like good enough. You would still be struggling, while good readers are like exponentially developing. So yes, the gap would between these two groups would be wider as they grow older, so that is very dangerous. Okay, yeah. So those two I feel like very important, and I hope to share of you all of you. So with this understanding, now we know that dyslexia is not as simple as letter reversal. It's not as simple about very good IQ, high IQ but poor reading. Because guess what? Even kids with lower IQ who are poor readers exhibit the same kind of difficulty with kids with high IQ and also have a struggling with reading. So, the brain of kids with high IQ, low IQ who are struggling with reading are the same. The brain activities are the same. They struggle with the same thing. They respond similarly to intervention. So IQ has less to do with reading difficulty than what we used to think of previously. And also, it doesn't mean that because this child has a high IQ, he or she would definitely benefit better from instruction. It doesn't mean like that. It has nothing, not to say nothing to do with IQ, but yeah, it is not kind of a relatable. It is negligible. IQ is, yes. And then, what exactly is happening in so what is the pattern or what are the behaviors of kids or people who are dyslexic? So they have phonological deficit. So when we talk about reading, this is another thing. So reading is a very complex process. So it is like my own analogy is like sports, right? So let's say if you are doing martial arts, you do not just memorize the pumse. If you're in taekwondo, the patterns. You do not just practice sparring. You would have to do all sorts of workout, cardio workout. You would have to tone your muscles. You would do like strength kind of workout. You would do speed kind of a workout. So a lot of workout just so that you can perform well in taekwondo. It's the same with reading. So reading involves a lot of other capacities that would enable good reading. So we're talking about visual perception is one of it. We're talking about language. We're talking about cognitive skills. We're talking about other kinds of processing. In fact, this book used hidden layers in the brain. So there is a lot that we do not know yet about how our brain works. Anyway, um, so capacities that enable reading. So a child doesn't necessarily have like a reading impairment because there is one part in the brain that is in charge of reading. No, apparently there's many parts in our brain that are in charge of reading, right? And those are parts, and we haven't talked about the connection, the neuron connection between our brains and between these parts when we talk about reading. So that's very interesting. So the impairment in any parts of the brain could then translate into difficulty in reading. But with people who have dyslexia, they have phonological deficit. Deficit in making that connection between letter and sounds. And another interesting thing is that this study called the what was it what effect? Was it the attribution? Not the Matthew effect. But basically, people who are dyslexic, their brain perceive letters or spelling patterns to be as, for example, patterns are supposed to be, something similar. Ben and 10 are similar in terms of patterns. The only thing which is different is the initial letter. But people with dyslexia view this to be more different than they are similar. Hence, the way they would learn Ben is as if they have never learned 10 before. So it is like a new learning for them every time. So which is why for people who are dyslexic, reading is laborious, decoding is laborious. I just find that very interesting. So yeah, so basically, if I were to quote from this book, the phonological deficit causes the reader to treat stimuli as different rather than picking up on their commonalities. Again, the implication is that less efficient learning, comprehension, production, and generalization, less efficient. I like the word efficient because our brain, macam mana the connections kan the connection is not as active or as deep for things that we have already learned. We do not pay attention for things that we have already automatized. For example, driving lah kan, driving, we have already learned how to drive. We do not pay attention to like, okay, where are my feet, where do I press, mana brake, mana minyak, gear ke, we don't pay so much attention anymore because it has already been automatized. Our brain is efficient that way. So now that we have learned how to drive, we pay attention to our surroundings now. We can even talk while we're driving. We can listen to music while we're driving. So that's efficiency. With reading, it's the same thing. So for kids who have phonological deficit, they pay too much attention to decoding. And a lot of then they don't make that connection, right? They don't pick up the similarity between patterns that are similar. Hence, they are learning new things every single time. So there, it is not efficient in that sense because learning that automatized would enable us to learn other more difficult things. But the dyslexic brain learn things as if they are all new. Yep. So I find that interesting as well. So maybe I should stop here. What other things should I maybe highlight? There are other things, of course, because this book also talks about the effect of SES on reading. They talk also about teacher training. The book also talk about um, provisions for reading instruction and things like that. So there are a lot of other things that maybe I should say for some other live sessions. But I think that is all for now because I feel like the things that I learned from these books are profound, and I hope to share this information with all of you. So, as usual, if you have anything to ask, please drop your comments, and I'll see you again, inshallah. Have a good day.